The grandfather clock in the Montgomery estate tolled like a funeral bell, each chime swallowing the hollow silence of the mansion. The air smelled of pine needles and untouched coffee, 2 cups on the oak table, one still rimmed with peach lipstick. Daniel Montgomery hadn't moved his wife's mug in 4 months. Outside December gnawed at the windows, but the real cold was inside. His daughter Lily crouched by the fireplace, clutching a doll stitched from her mother's favorite cashmere scarf, its embroidered smile frayed at the edges. She hadn't spoken since the car crash. Neither had Daniel. Then he saw her, a small figure darting past the snow-laden hedges. At first he thought it was a stray dog, but the way she moved, hesitant, hungry, made his breath hitch. A child no older than Lily, wrapped in a man's tattered overcoat, her fingers purple with cold as she scavenged through the trash bins. Something inside Daniel cracked open. He grabbed his parka and sprinted outside, the snow biting his cheeks. "Hey!" he called softly, but the girl flinched like a startled deer. She clutched a rusted locket to her chest, her eyes wide with a fear no 6-year-old should know. "I'm not gonna hurt you," Daniel said, kneeling to her level. The wind howled between them. "You lost." She shook her head, then nodded, then burst into tears. That's when he noticed the bruises on her wrist, finger-shaped, fresh. His stomach turned. Behind him, Lily appeared in the doorway, her doll dangling at her side. For the first time in months, she spoke. "Daddy," she whispered. "Can she stay?" The girl's name was Mia. She'd walked 3 miles from a trailer park where the locks didn't work, and the adults forgot to feed her. Daniel bandaged her hands while Lily piled crackers and peanut butter onto a plate. Mia devoured it like she'd never seen food. Later, as the girls dozed under a quilt by the fire, Daniel made a call. Not to social services, not yet. First, to his construction crew. "I need a playhouse built by morning," he said, "with a real door and a lock." The next day, as Mia traced her fingers over the freshly painted walls of her new sanctuary, Daniel watched Lily teach her how to braid the doll's hair. The clock chimed again, but this time it didn't sound like an ending. It sounded like a second chance. Daniel knelt in the snow, his breath forming clouds in the icy air. The girl Ruby stood frozen, her knuckles white around the rusted button. The wind howled, but her stillness was louder. When he spoke, his voice was rough with an emotion he hadn't felt in years. "Christmas is for family," he said, "and no one should be alone tonight." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Ruby's gaze flicked to the house, where golden light spilled through the windows. Somewhere inside, Lily waited, her small fingers curled around that ragged doll. Ruby took a step, then another. When Daniel offered his hand, she hesitated, her eyes darting to his face as if searching for a trick. But then slowly, so slowly, her icy fingers brushed his. The moment they crossed the threshold, the house seemed to exhale. Warmth wrapped around them, but Ruby didn't relax. She stood rigid in the foyer's snow melting from her hair onto the hardwood. Her eyes locked onto the Christmas tree, its lights reflecting in her pupils like distant stars. Daniel moved to the kitchen, filling a mug with hot chocolate, stirring in extra marshmallows, just like Lily liked. When he turned back, Ruby hadn't budged. But Lily had. The little girl patted down the stairs, her unicorn pajamas whispering against the steps. She stopped halfway, gripping the banister. For the first time in months, her voice was clear. "You're cold," she said to Ruby. Not a question, a fact. Lily vanished upstairs and returned, clutching a knitted blanket, the one her mother had made last winter. She held it out, her small arms trembling with the weight of it. Ruby's breath hitched. The button clattered to the floor. Then came the knock at the door. 3 sharp raps, too forceful for the hour. Daniel's spine stiffened. Through the frosted glass, a shadow loomed, a man in a police uniform, his stance wide, impatient. Ruby's entire body went taut. She scrambled backward, her socked feet slipping until her back hit the wall. "No," she whispered, a plea wrapped in terror. "Not him." Daniel's pulse roared in his ears. He'd seen that look before on Grace's face the night of the accident, the night she'd begged him not to answer the door. Lily's small hand slipped into his. "Daddy," she said, her voice steady. "We have to help her." The knock came again, louder this time. The choice hung in the air like a blade. Ruby cradled the doll in her hands like it was made of glass. The firelight caught the mismatched buttons of its eyes, making them gleam like tiny stars. Zoe rocked back on her heels, watching with quiet pride. Then, without warning, Ruby's face crumpled. A single tear cut through the dirt on her cheek. Daniel's throat tightened. He'd seen that kind of crying before, the silent, shuddering kind that came from somewhere too deep for words. But before he could move, Zoe did something extraordinary. She reached into the pocket of her pajamas and pulled out a hair ribbon, the last one her mother had bought her, still tied in a perfect bow. Without hesitation, she stretched it toward Ruby. "For your hair," she said, "so the snow won't stick." Ruby stared at the ribbon, then at Zoe, her lips parting in something between disbelief and wonder. The doll trembled in her grip. Then the doorbell rang. Not a knock this time, a sharp, insistent chime that shattered the moment. Ruby flinched so hard the cocoa sloshed over the rim of the mug, scalding her wrist. She didn't make a sound. Daniel's muscles coiled. Through the sidelight, a figure shifted broad shoulders, a badge glinting under the porch light. The officer from before. Zoe's small hand slipped into Ruby's. "Hide," she whispered. But Ruby didn't run. She set the doll carefully on the floor, wiped her face with her sleeve, and squared her shoulders. When she spoke, her voice was steadier than Daniel expected. "He'll break the door if you don't answer." Daniel's pulse hammered. He glanced at the girls, then at the door. The bell rang again, longer this time, a threat disguised as a sound. Zoe squeezed Ruby's hand tighter. "Daddy," she said, her voice low and fierce. "Tell him we're all having Christmas." Something in Daniel's chest cracked open. He strode to the door, yanked it open, and froze. The officer wasn't alone. A social worker stood beside him, her clipboard pressed to her chest. Behind them, snow swirled around a parked cruiser, its lights off, but its engine running. The officer's gaze slid past Daniel, locking onto Ruby. "There she is," he said, smiling like he'd won something. "We've been looking everywhere for you, kid." Ruby's breath came fast and shallow. Zoe stepped in front of her, the hair ribbon still clutched in her fist. Daniel planted himself in the doorway, blocking the cold. "You'll have to come back tomorrow," he said. His voice didn't shake. "It's Christmas Eve, and we're in the middle of something." The social worker's pen hovered over her paperwork. The officer's smile vanished, and behind Daniel, very softly, Ruby began to hum a tune Grace used to sing, a lullaby. Zoe joined in. The notes hung in the air like defiance, like family. Daniel sat in the dim glow of the nightlight, watching Ruby's flushed face. Her breathing was too quick, her skin burning under his touch. The button, that damned rusted button, was still clenched in her fist like some last tether to a world that had failed her. He reached for the phone on the nightstand, then stopped. A memory sliced through him. Grace propped up in this same guest bed years ago, her cheeks fever bright as she laughed through a bout of pneumonia. "Stop fussing," she'd said, swatting his hand away. "A little soup and a lot of love fixes most things." The floor creaked. Zoe stood in the doorway, her unicorn pajamas rumpled, her own forehead creased with worry. "She's sick," she whispered. "Not a question." Daniel nodded. Zoe disappeared and returned, dragging a step stool, her arms laden with supplies, a bowl of water, the faded Minnie Mouse towel from her bathroom, and a half-used tube of strawberry-scented vapor rub Grace had bought on a whim. She climbed onto the bed with the solemnity of a battlefield nurse. Ruby stirred as Zoe dabbed the cool towel across her forehead. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy with fever. For a terrifying second, Daniel thought she might bolt. Then Zoe pressed the vapor rub into Ruby's palm. "Mommy used this when I got sick," she said. "It smells like candy, but it fixes everything." Ruby's fingers uncurled from the button just enough to touch the tube. The scent of artificial strawberries filled the room. Downstairs, the grandfather clock struck midnight. A new sound cut through the house. Not the doorbell, not the wind, but the shrill ring of Daniel's cell phone. The screen flashed, unknown number. His thumb hovered over the decline button when Ruby suddenly spoke. Her voice cracked with fever. "It's him." Zoe's hand froze mid-dab. The phone rang again. Daniel answered. A man's voice rough with static. "You got my kid." The air left Daniel's lungs. Ruby had gone perfectly still, her fever-bright eyes locked on him. Zoe snatched the phone. "She's ours now," she said with terrifying certainty. Then she hung up. Silence. Ruby let out a shuddering breath, not of fear, but relief. The button finally clattered to the floor. Outside, snow began to fall again, thick and fast, burying the tracks of whoever had been coming for her. Daniel picked up the button. It left rust stains on his fingers. He pocketed it, then reached for the vapor rub. "All right," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Let's get you better." Somewhere in the house, the clock chimed again. This time it sounded like a promise. Daniel smoothed the crumpled drawing between his fingers, the crayon smudged from Zoe's urgent grip. 3 figures stood hand in hand beneath a lopsided Christmas tree. A tall man, a small girl in unicorn pajamas, and between them a third figure with wild scribbles of red hair. At the bottom, in Zoe's uneven scrawl, "Our family now." A sound from the bed made him turn. Ruby was thrashing her fever dreams, pulling her under. The washcloth had slipped to the pillow. As he moved to replace it, her free hand shot out and grabbed his wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes flew open, glassy, unseeing, and she gasped a single word, "Mama!" The button fell from her grasp at last. It hit the hardwood with a ping, rolling in frantic circles before coming to rest against Daniel's shoe. He picked it up, turning it over in his palm. The rust had flaked away where Ruby's grip had worn it down, revealing engraved letters, JS. Downstairs, the front door creaked open. Zoe screamed. Daniel was halfway down the stairs when he saw him, a gaunt man in a soiled mechanic's jacket, reeking of gasoline and whiskey, gripping Zoe's arm. "Where is she?" The man slurred. His bloodshot eyes locked onto Daniel. "Where's my damn kid?" The button burned in Daniel's fist. JS Jason Joseph. Some monster who'd let a child scavenge through trash in December. Then came Ruby's voice, thin but clear from the top of the stairs. "You're not my daddy." The man's grip on Zoe loosened just enough. Daniel lunged, tackling him into the Christmas tree. Ornaments shattered, lights sparked. The man's fist connected with Daniel's jaw, but he barely felt it. Somewhere in the chaos, Zoe was dialing 911, her tiny voice reciting their address with terrifying calm. Ruby descended the stairs like a ghost, the fever still painting her cheeks crimson. She knelt beside the struggling men and pressed something into the intruder's palm, the button. "This is all you left me," she whispered. The man went still. His fingers closed around it mechanically, his face slack with something like recognition, or maybe shame. Sirens wailed in the distance. Daniel pulled Ruby and Zoe close as the man crumpled to his knees, the button clutched in his dirty hand. The first police cruiser skidded to a stop outside, lights painting the snow blue and red. Ruby turned her face into Daniel's chest. He expected tears. Instead, she exhaled a long, shuddering breath that seemed to leave years of fear with it. Zoe tugged his sleeve. "Daddy," she said, pointing to the wrecked tree. Amid the broken ornaments, one still hung intact, a porcelain angel with Grace's handwriting on the underside. "For the family will grow." Daniel pressed his lips to Ruby's burning forehead. The sirens grew louder. The house held its breath. And for the first time in forever, so did he. Daniel woke to the smell of burning toast and the sound of giggling. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, painting Ruby's face in gold as she slept peacefully, the button finally loose in her relaxed fingers. The fever had broken. Downstairs, chaos reigned. Zoe stood on a kitchen chair, wielding a spatula like a sword, while smoke curled from the toaster. A dozen eggs sat uncracked on the counter, and a gallon of milk teetered precariously near the edge. "We're making breakfast," she announced when Daniel appeared, her face smeared with what might have been jam. Ruby's quiet voice came from behind him. "You're gonna burn the house down." Daniel turned to find her leaning against the doorway, dwarfed in one of Zoe's old nightgowns, her feet swimming in fuzzy slippers. The drawing, "Our Family Now," was clutched in her hand. Zoe beamed. "You're just in time for pancakes." She held up a charred, lumpy disc. Ruby's lips twitched. Then, to Daniel's astonishment, she let out a real laugh, bright and startled, like she'd forgotten the sound of her own joy. It lit up the room more than the winter sun ever could. Daniel moved to the stove, taking the spatula from Zoe's sticky hands. "All right, sous chefs," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Let's do this properly." Ruby hesitated, then stepped forward. "I can crack eggs," she offered softly. Zoe shoved a bowl toward her. "The yellow part goes in the pan, not on the floor." As Ruby carefully tapped an egg against the rim, Daniel noticed the way her hands no longer shook. The button sat abandoned on the counter, its edges catching the light. Outside, a car door slammed. Through the window, Daniel saw the social worker from last night, walking up the driveway, her clipboard under one arm. His stomach dropped. The pancakes suddenly seemed trivial. Ruby froze, egg dripping between her fingers. Zoe grabbed her hand. "Don't worry," she whispered loudly. "Dad's rich. He'll just buy you." Daniel choked on his coffee. "But Ruby..." Ruby squared her shoulders. She wiped her hands on the nightgown, walked to the door, and opened it before the social worker could knock. Morning light haloed her small frame as she spoke the words that shattered and rebuilt Daniel's heart all at once. "This is my home now." The social worker blinked. Behind Ruby, Zoe nodded fiercely, brandishing her spatula like a scepter. Daniel held his breath. Then, miraculously, the woman smiled. She tucked her clipboard under her arm and said, "Well then, let's talk about what comes next." Ruby turned back to Daniel, her eyes wide with hope and something dangerously close to belonging. The button on the counter gleamed forgotten. Somewhere in the house, the grandfather clock chimed. Not an ending. A beginning. The scissors slipped from Daniel's fingers, clattering onto the coffee table. Ruby's words hung in the air, fragile, sacred. Zoe reached out slowly, her small fingers brushing the snowflake Ruby had called her mother's earrings. The paper trembled between them. Then Ruby did something extraordinary. She reached into her pajama pocket and pulled out the rusted button. For the first time, she set it down deliberately right in the center of the table where the lamplight caught the faint JS engraving. "This was his," she said softly. "But the snowflakes are hers." Daniel's throat tightened. He didn't ask who he was. The bruises on Ruby's wrists that morning had told that story. Instead, he reached for another sheet of paper. "Show me," he said, "what your mom's earrings looked like." Ruby's eyes widened. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then she picked up the scissors with steady hands and began to cut not the haphazard shapes from before, but careful, deliberate arcs. The paper unfolded to reveal a delicate six-pointed star, each point ending in a tiny heart. Zoe gasped. "It's magic!" Daniel blinked hard. He knew that design. Grace had owned a pair just like them vintage Art Deco earrings she'd worn on their wedding day. His hands shook as he taped Ruby's creation to the center of the window where the morning light set it glowing. The doorbell rang. This time it was the social worker and a police officer, but their postures were different. Relaxed. The officer held a file folder instead of a flashlight. "Mr. Montgomery." The social worker said, "We've located Ruby's extended family." Daniel's heart stopped. Ruby's scissors hit the floor. The social worker knelt, meeting Ruby at eye level. "Your aunt flew in from Milwaukee. She's been looking for you since November." She opened the folder to reveal a photo, a woman with Ruby's same russet hair standing beside a Christmas tree, holding a handmade sign that read, "Come home, Ruby Rose." Ruby's breath came fast. "Aunt Liddy," she whispered like the name was a secret too precious to say aloud. Daniel's vision blurred. He'd braced for a fight for court dates, for sleepless nights, trying to prove this broken little girl belonged with them. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. Zoe burst into tears. Then something miraculous happened. Ruby turned and grabbed Zoe's hands. "It's okay," she said fiercely, echoing the words they'd all clung to these past days. "Aunt Liddy has a farm, with baby goats, and a tree house." She looked at Daniel, her eyes blazing with a hope so bright it hurt. "She'll let you visit. I know it," the social worker smiled. "In fact," she pulled out another photo. Aunt Liddy's farmhouse with an extra bedroom, already painted sunflower yellow. A bed with 2 pillows, a bookshelf half filled. "She's expecting you all for Christmas." Daniel exhaled for what felt like the first time in years. The paper snowflakes trembled in the sudden draft from the open door. Outside, the real snow had stopped falling. The world stood still, holding its breath. Ruby picked up the button one last time, then placed it in Daniel's palm. "Keep this for me," she asked, "until I come back." Daniel folded his fingers over it. The metal was warm from her pocket, from her heart. Zoe wiped her nose on her sleeve and grabbed Ruby's hand. "Can we make snowflakes for your aunt's windows, too?" As the girls fell into a frenzy of construction paper and glitter, Daniel stepped onto the porch. The winter air was crisp clean, the kind that made you believe in fresh starts. Somewhere in Milwaukee, a woman with Ruby's smile was hanging a wreath on her door. Somewhere in this house, Grace's earrings sparkled in a jewelry box. And right here, right now, 2 little girls' laughter spilled through the open doorway, scattering like light through a prism. Daniel pressed the button to his chest. It no longer felt like an ending. It felt like the first page. Daniel ran his fingers over Grace's half-finished sunflower, the yellow paint still vibrant where her brush had left it. Moonlight spilled through the studio windows, turning the jars of turpentine into liquid silver. He picked up her favorite brush, the one with the chewed wooden handle from art school, and for the first time in months the memory didn't slice. It warmed. A sound made him turn. Ruby stood in the doorway, dwarfed in one of Zoe's nightgowns, her feet bare against the cold hardwood. In her hand she held something that made Daniel's breath catch, a tiny pair of earrings. Silver stars, one missing a point. "They fell out of my pocket," she whispered, "when I was running." Daniel knelt until they were eye level. The broken star glinted in his palm, its edges catching the light just like Grace's used to. Somewhere in the house, Zoe's sleepy laughter drifted down the hall. She must have been telling Ruby's doll a bedtime story. Ruby touched the unfinished sunflower on the easel. "My mom liked yellow too," she said. Then, with the devastating wisdom of children who've lost too much, "It's okay if you keep her things. I still have my button." Daniel's vision blurred. He reached for a fresh canvas. By midnight, the studio smelled of new gesso and possibility. Ruby sat cross-legged on the drop cloth, carefully painting a lopsided goat for Aunt Liddy's farm, while Daniel mixed colors nearby. The broken earring gleamed on the windowsill between them, catching the light like a promise. Down the hall, Zoe slept with Ruby's drawing taped above her bed, the words, "My new family," glowing under her nightlight. Outside, the first snow of December began to fall, soft, silent, and endless. Daniel dipped his brush into the paint. The sunflower would wait. Tonight, he was adding a third star to the sky. Daniel set the laundry basket down as the social worker's pen hovered over her clipboard. The house held its breath, the crackling fire, the faint squeak of floorboards upstairs where the girls were playing. Even the Christmas lights seemed to dim in anticipation. Angela Ruiz closed her folder with a quiet snap. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice softer now, "do you know why Ruby was digging through your trash that morning?" A floorboard creaked above them. Daniel looked up to see two small shadows huddled at the top of the stairs. Zoe's unicorn pajama leg, Ruby's sock-covered foot peeking out from beneath the banister. He turned back to Angela, because it was the only place left to look. The social worker's gaze drifted to the fridge where Ruby's drawing hung, the three of them beneath a lopsided star, the words "My New Family" in careful crayon. Then to the windowsill where a single paper snowflake trembled in the draft. Angela reached into her briefcase and pulled out a photograph. Her aunt's flight lands at 6. Daniel's hands curled into fists. But Angela continued, placing another photo beside it, this one showing Ruby at the kitchen table that morning, cheeks smeared with pancake batter, laughing as Zoe attempted to braid her hair. "I think we can arrange for the home study to take place after the new year." A gasp came from upstairs. Ruby's small face appeared between the railings, her eyes wide. Angela stood smoothing her skirt. "I'll need to speak with her alone, of course." She reached into her pocket and pulled out something that made Daniel's throat tighten, a silver star earring, its twin to the broken one in his studio. "Her aunt asked me to give her this." Ruby came down the stairs like a whisper, her fingers trailing along the wall for balance. When she saw the earring, her entire body stilled. "That's," her voice cracked, "Mama's other one." Angela knelt, holding it out. "Your aunt kept it safe for you." Ruby took the earring with trembling hands. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then she did something extraordinary. She walked to Daniel and pressed it into his palm. "You should keep this one too," she whispered. "So they match." Upstairs, Zoe started singing Jingle Bells at the top of her lungs, badly, deliberately off-key. A distraction, a gift. Angela smiled as she packed her briefcase. "I'll see myself out." As the front door closed, Daniel looked down at the earring in his hand, then at Ruby's hopeful face. Outside, the snow began to fall again, fresh, clean, covering every footprint. Somewhere in Milwaukee, an aunt was packing sunflower sheets into a suitcase. Somewhere in this house, a little girl was singing through the cracks in her heart. And right here, right now, Daniel Montgomery knelt and pulled Ruby close, the two silver stars burning bright in his palm like twin promises. The social worker's car pulled away. The clock struck noon. Somewhere between lost and found, a family breathed. Daniel crossed the room in 3 strides, the word "Daddy" still ringing in his ears like a bell. Moonlight spilled through the curtains, painting Ruby's tear-streaked face silver as she clutched Zoe's hand. "I'm sorry." Ruby whispered, shrinking into her sleeping bag. I didn't mean to. Zoe sat bolt upright. She had a bad dream about the button man. Her small voice trembled with protective fury. He can't take her back. He left her in the snow. Daniel knelt beside them, his pulse roaring. The social worker's words echoed in his mind, background checks, interviews, next of kin, but right now none of that mattered. Only this Ruby's icy fingers gripping his Zoe's fierce glare, daring the world to try and separate them. He gathered them both into his arms, their hearts pounding against his chest like frightened birds. Listen to me, he said, his voice rough with certainty. No one's taking anyone. Ruby's breath hitched. But the rules... To hell with the rules, Daniel said and meant it. Zoe gasped at the swear, then giggled wildly. Ruby's eyes went round. Daniel pressed his forehead to theirs. Tomorrow we're calling Angela back. We're getting a lawyer. We're fighting. He touched Ruby's cheek, still damp with tears. If you want to stay. Ruby didn't speak. She didn't have to. The way she launched herself into his arms said everything, her face buried in his shoulder. Her tiny fists clutching his shirt, like he was the only anchor in a stormy sea. Zoe piled on top her unicorn pajamas, glowing in the moonlight. Somewhere downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed midnight. Somewhere in Milwaukee, an aunt pressed pause on packing those sunflower sheets. And right here in this patch of moonlight on the floor, 3 broken hearts started beating as one. Daniel carried them both to the big bed where they curled together like parentheses around his sides. As their breathing slowed, he stared at the ceiling, plotting his next move. CEOs knew how to fight, how to win. The button sat on the nightstand, its rust glowing faintly in the dark. For the first time in months, Daniel Montgomery slept through the night. Daniel stepped back to admire their work, the scent of fresh paint still hanging in the air. The studio had transformed. Sunlight streamed through gauzy curtains onto the sage-green walls, catching the paper lanterns Zoe had hung with such determination. The unfinished sunflower canvas now had a new home above the dresser, its golden petals glowing against the soft green. A small sound made him turn. Ruby stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, clutching the ragged doll to her chest. She took one tentative step forward, then another, her socked feet sinking into the plush rug. It's... Her voice cracked as she touched the snowflake taped to the window, the one she'd made that first day. Mine. Zoe barreled past Daniel, grabbing Ruby's hand. Come see the best part. She dragged her to the closet, flinging it open to reveal a miniature art easel and a set of brushes. Dad says you can paint whatever you want, even goats. Ruby's fingers hovered over the brushes, trembling. Then she turned to Daniel, her face doing something extraordinary. It broke open not in grief, but in wonder. You kept her sunflower, she whispered. Daniel knelt, his knees popping in a way that would have made Grace laugh. Some stories aren't meant to be painted over, he said, tapping the canvas lightly. They're meant to grow new chapters. Ruby threw her arms around his neck, her tears warm against his skin. The doll, Grace's sweater doll, got squished between them, its button eyes staring up at the ceiling where Zoe had secretly taped one last surprise, a single silver star cut from wrapping paper right above the bed. Downstairs, the doorbell rang. Angela stood on the porch, her briefcase in one hand and a thick folder in the other. Through the window, Daniel could see a rental car idling in the driveway, and inside it, a woman with russet hair clutching a stuffed goat. Ruby's breath hitched. Aunt Liddy! Daniel squeezed her shoulder. You ready? Zoe grabbed Ruby's other hand, her small face fierce. Remember, you get to choose. The words hung in the air like the paper lanterns above them, fragile and luminous. Ruby took a deep breath. Then she reached up and touched the silver star above her new bed just once before walking toward the stairs, toward the door, toward whatever came next. Daniel followed, his heart full and breaking all at once. The studio door swung shut behind them, catching the sunlight just so, making the unfinished sunflower glow like it was finally impossibly complete. Daniel found them curled together in Ruby's new bed, Zoe's arm thrown protectively across her like a shield, both girls breathing in sync beneath the glow of paper lanterns. The ceramic cup of crayons sat on the nightstand beside Ruby's open drawer, the rusted button visible in its corner, no longer hidden in a fist, but resting peacefully where she could see it. He was about to turn off the light when Ruby's sleepy voice stopped him. Daddy. The word hung in the air, fragile and brave. Daniel crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling beside the bed. Ruby's small hand found his, her fingers still smelling of grilled cheese and new crayons. "Will you tell us about the stars?" she whispered. Zoe's eyes fluttered open, suddenly alert. "Yeah, the story about how Mom painted them." Daniel's throat tightened. Grace had mixed silver into her oils to make constellations on Zoe's ceiling when she was afraid of the dark. He looked up at the paper lanterns, then at the single silver star Zoe had taped above Ruby's pillow. "Once upon a time," he began, his voice rough with memory and hope, "there was a woman who believed even broken things could shine." Ruby's grip tightened around his fingers as he spoke, her eyelids growing heavy. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft, silent, and endless. The button remained in the drawer, no longer a talisman of loss, but a relic of the night she stopped running. And in the hallway, just visible through the cracked door, Angela's final report lay on the entryway table, its recommendation page gleaming under the hall light. Placement approved pending kinship assessment. But for now, in this room aglow with makeshift stars, there were only 3 heartbeats and the quiet certainty that whatever came next, they'd face it together. Daniel kissed both foreheads, then turned out the light. The lanterns swayed gently, casting constellations across the walls. Somewhere between awake and dreaming, Ruby smiled. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of Angela's words still settling in his chest. The house hummed around him, Zoe's giggles from the living room, Ruby's socked feet padding across the hardwood, the faint scent of burned cookies lingering in the air. He pushed off the door just as Ruby appeared, clutching Daisy the doll with one hand and reaching for him with the other. "Daddy," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "can we make hot chocolate?" The word daddy no longer made him catch his breath. It felt as natural as the winter sunlight streaming through the windows. Zoe popped up behind Ruby, her hair a wild halo of static electricity from the blankets. "With extra marshmallows?" Daniel scooped them both up, one in each arm, their laughter warm against his neck. "Only if we use the special mug," he said, nodding toward the snowflake-patterned one Grace had loved, the one Ruby had claimed as her own. As they moved to the kitchen, Daniel caught sight of the new drawing on the fridge, 4 stick figures now holding hands beneath a lopsided star. His throat tightened. The legal battle would come. The home studies, the court dates, the inevitable delays. But right now, in this golden moment, none of that mattered. Ruby climbed onto the counter to reach the cocoa powder, her tongue poking out in concentration. Zoe rummaged through the pantry for the good marshmallows, and Daniel stood in the center of it all, his heart so full he thought it might burst. The button remained in Ruby's drawer. The sunflower canvas still glowed on her wall. And somewhere in the spaces between grief and joy, Grace's laughter echoed in the clatter of mugs, the squeals of his daughters, the promise of a family rebuilt not from scratch, but from love's stubborn, unbreakable pieces. Daniel turned on the stove, the flame blooming blue and bright. Outside, the first snowdrops pushed through the frost. Spring was coming. The morning of Ruby's birthday dawned bright and clear, the last frost of winter glittering on the lawn like scattered diamonds. Daniel stood at the kitchen window, watching sunlight catch the locket around Ruby's neck as she sat at the table, swinging her legs and carefully counting out 6 blueberries onto her pancake, 1 for each year. Zoe burst into the room wearing a tinfoil crown and dragging a laundry basket full of handmade gifts. "Breakfast in bed for the birthday girl," she announced, plopping a stack of slightly burned toast onto a plate. Ruby giggled, the locket warm against her chest. "But I'm already at the table." "Then it's breakfast at bed," Zoe declared, shoving the plate toward her. Daniel turned back to the stove to hide his smile. The mac and cheese from last night sat forgotten in the fridge this morning, called for chocolate chip pancakes shaped like stars. As he flipped the first one, the doorbell rang. Not the social worker, not the lawyer, but a delivery man holding an enormous box stamped with the logo of Portland's premier art supply store. Ruby's eyes went wide as saucers when Daniel carried it in. "For me," Zoe tore at the packaging before Daniel could find scissors. Inside lay every art supply a budding 6-year-old artist could dream of: watercolors in jewel tones, sketchbooks with thick paper, even a tiny apron with Ruby's studio embroidered across the front. At the very bottom, wrapped in tissue paper, was a single paintbrush. Not new, not store-bought. Grace's favorite, its chewed handle gleaming with fresh varnish. Ruby touched it reverently, her small fingers tracing the teeth marks Grace had left behind. When she looked up at Daniel, her eyes held galaxies. "Now you can paint your own sunflowers," he said softly. The pancakes burned. The toast went cold. And in the golden morning light, with Zoe's off-key rendition of Happy Birthday echoing through the house, Ruby Montgomery held her mother's brush in one hand and her new family's locket in the other, two halves of a heart finally beating as one. Outside, the last of the winter frost melted into the earth, making way for spring. For sunflowers. For beginnings. Daniel's hands trembled as he held the card, the porch light catching the glitter in Ruby's uneven stars. Somewhere inside, Zoe was teaching Angela how to properly lick frosting off a spoon, their laughter drifting through the screen door. He pulled Ruby onto his lap, her bare feet cold against his legs. The locket glinted in the twilight, both photos safely tucked inside her past and present side by side. "You know," he said, tapping the court document still clutched in her small hand, "this paper doesn't make you ours. That happened the moment you took my hand in the snow." Ruby leaned back against his chest, her head fitting perfectly beneath his chin. "I know," she whispered. Then, with the devastating wisdom of children who've learned to name their wounds, "But it helps the scared parts believe it's real." The music box played faintly from inside Twinkle Twinkle, mingling with the evening crickets. Daniel pressed his lips to the top of Ruby's head, breathing in the scent of crayons and cupcake frosting. Somewhere in Milwaukee, a kind woman packed sunflower seeds into an envelope to mail. Somewhere in Portland, a judge's stamp waited to make official what their hearts already knew. And right here on this creaky porch swing with his daughter Daniel Montgomery realized something extraordinary. Grief had not shrunk. Love had simply grown larger around it. Ruby twisted to look at him, her nose scrunched in that way Zoe's did when she was scheming. "Can we get a dog?" Daniel threw his head back and laughed, a full, unguarded sound that startled the fireflies into blinking. Inside, Zoe shrieked, "I called dibs on naming it." The music box wound down. The stars came out. And in the space between before and after, a family of 4, 2 by blood, 2 by choice, all by love, stepped into the light. The courtroom air smelled of lemon polish and old books as Ruby stood before the judge, her navy dress barely rustling. Daniel held his breath, watching her small fingers clutch the folded paper, the same pink cardstock that had read, "Thank you for my heart back." Judge Reeves removed her glasses. "Young lady," she said in a voice that reminded Daniel of warm milk and bedtime stories, "I have one very important question for you today." Ruby's shoulders tensed. The locket glinted at her throat. "Where does your heart feel safest?" The question hung in the air like a soap bubble. Daniel saw Angela's pen hover over her notepad, saw Zoe squeeze Ruby's hand so hard her own knuckles turned white. Then Ruby did something extraordinary. She unfolded her paper, not the court documents, but a new drawing. 4 stick figures beneath a rainbow holding hands, one with a judge's gavel, one with a social worker's clipboard, and in the center a tiny girl with russet hair, her chest radiating yellow scribbles like sunbeams. "Here," Ruby whispered, pressing the drawing to her chest where the locket lay, "with my dad." The gavel didn't so much fall as sigh against its block. Judge Reeves's eyes glistened as she slid a box of tissues toward Angela. "Well then," she murmured, "I believe we're done." Daniel sank to his knees just as Ruby turned and launched herself into his arms, her tears warm against his neck. Zoe piled on top, her triumphant whisper, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear, "I told you we'd win." Outside, the spring rain had stopped. Sunlight broke through the clouds as they descended the courthouse steps, Ruby's adoption papers fluttering in her hand like a captured butterfly. Angela snapped a photo with her phone, the 3 of them haloed in golden light, Ruby's face alight with something too big for words. That night, as Daniel tucked them into bed, Ruby in her room, Zoe stubbornly in the sleeping bag beside her, Ruby reached under her pillow and produced one final surprise, a sunflower seed packet from Aunt Liddy, addressed in careful cursive, "For your first garden with Dad." Zoe gasped, "We can plant them by Mom's roses." Daniel's throat tightened. Grace's roses had withered to brittle sticks after her death. He'd been too grief-stricken to water them. Ruby's small hand found his. "They'll grow together," she said with certainty. "The sunflowers and the roses. They'll keep each other company." The seed packet crinkled as Daniel hugged them both, the legal papers on the dresser already fading into background noise. What mattered was this Zoe's sleepy yawn, Ruby's contented sigh, and the way the nightlight caught the engraving on Ruby's locket as it swung forward, family on one side, chosen on the other. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed midnight. Somewhere in Milwaukee, a woman smiled at a photo texted from Angela's phone. And in a quiet bedroom aglow with paper lanterns, 2 little girls whispered plans for tomorrow while their father listened at the door, his heart so full he thought it might burst. The sunflowers would bloom come summer, but the miracle had already happened. Daniel placed the courthouse photo beside Grace's memory box, the glass catching the last golden light of evening. In it, Ruby's smile outshone the sun breaking through Portland's clouds. Zoe's arms locked around her waist, like a promise, his own hands steady on their shoulders, anchoring them to this moment, to this life they'd chosen. A soft knock at the study door. Ruby stood there barefoot in her pajamas, Daisy the doll tucked under one arm. "Daddy," she whispered, "can we put Mommy's picture back up too?" The question hung between them, fragile as a dandelion seed. Daniel knelt the hardwood cool beneath his knees. "You sure?" Ruby nodded, her locket clicking open as she leaned forward. Inside, both photos smiled up at them, her birth mother's faded grin beside their courthouse joy. "Both my moms should see the sunflowers grow," she said simply. Daniel's vision blurred as he lifted Grace's photo from the velvet box. The frame clicked against the wall beside their new family portrait, her laughing eyes watching over them once more. From down the hall came Zoe's indignant shout, "Ruby, you promised we'd name the dog together." Ruby rolled her eyes with all the exasperation of a seasoned little sister and turned to go, but not before pressing a quick kiss to Grace's picture, her small fingers brushing the glass like a blessing. Daniel stood in the doorway watching his daughters bicker over dog names, Zoe insisting on Sir Bark-Salot, Ruby campaigning for Sunny, their voices weaving through the house like music. The memory box remained open on the shelf, its treasures no longer hidden away, but waiting for Ruby's questions, for Zoe's stories, for the days when grief would come visiting, but no longer stay. Outside, the first fireflies of spring blinked in the gathering dark. The rose bushes stood sentinel by the garden gate, their dry branches waiting for morning, for seeds, for the miracle of roots remembering how to grow. Daniel took one last look at the photos side by side, then turned off the light and walked toward the laughter. Grace's brush waited in Ruby's studio. The sunflower seeds waited in their packet. And in this house full of second chances, love waited everywhere. Daniel traced the crayon lines of Ruby's drawing with his thumb, the glass cool beneath his fingertips. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the two photos on the mantel, Grace's joyful hospital moment with newborn Zoe, and this new constellation of their family forged in courtroom sunlight. Zoe's voice carried down the hall, singing off-key as she brushed her teeth, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you—" The lyrics dissolved into giggles as Ruby joined in, their voices twining together like vines. Daniel placed the new drawing between the photos, completing the triptych. Past, present, future, all equally sacred now. Outside, the first true night of spring settled over Portland, the air sweet with cherry blossoms. Somewhere in the dark, the rose bushes stood sentinel over freshly turned earth where sunflower seeds slept waiting. Ruby tugged his sleeve. "Daddy, come tuck us in properly." Her locket caught the firelight as she moved, both sides gleaming, the mother she'd lost and the family she'd found, forever bound by this golden hinge of love. Daniel followed his daughters upstairs, his footsteps sure and steady on the hardwood. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, its pendulum swinging like a heartbeat. In Ruby's room, Zoe had already burrowed into the sleeping bag, her unicorn pajamas peeking out from beneath 3 blankets. Ruby climbed into her bed, Daisy the doll tucked under one arm, Grace's paintbrush safe in its jar on the art table. Daniel kissed each forehead, Zoe's familiar warmth, Ruby's still new scent of crayons and possibility. As he reached the door, a small voice stopped him. "Dad?" Ruby sat up, her face serious in the glow of the paper lanterns. "Do you think the sunflowers will bloom by Mother's Day?" The question hung in the air, delicate as a dandelion seed. Daniel looked at the photos on her wall, the unfinished sunflower canvas, the courthouse snapshot, the stick figure drawing of their first meeting by the trash cans. "I think," he said softly, "they'll bloom exactly when they're meant to." Ruby nodded, satisfied, and curled around her doll. Down the hall, Grace's studio stood, ready brushes, waiting, blank canvases leaning against the wall, a child-sized apron hanging from its hook. Daniel turned off the light, leaving the door cracked just enough to let the hallway glow spill in like moonlight. As he walked downstairs, the house sighed around him, no longer too quiet, no longer too big, but simply home. The fire burned low. The clock ticked on. And on the mantel, 3 frames stood witness to the miracle of a family rebuilt, not from the ashes of what was lost, but from the unshakable truth that love once given never really ends. It simply changes form. It waits in studio corners and courtroom smiles, in sunflower seeds and rusted buttons, in small hands that reach out from the shadows, and bigger ones that learn just in time how to hold on,